Welcome to the Healing Road Podcast. I'm Jim Owens, a licensed counselor and professor of psychology.
And I'm Ben Pohl, a Catholic high school campus minister. Join us as we pursue healing through the life-changing power of relationship with God. Welcome to episode 3 of season 1 of the Healing Road Podcast. Thank you for joining us, and today we're going to be hearing from Jim about one of his healing stories, and it's something that I think is really important to be heard, really important for Jim to share, and something that I think is going to impact a lot of people who are listening, because I think it's something that's a real common experience that a lot of us have, and we're pretty convinced that this is an important message to share. One of the reasons not only is because of the topic, or what Jim's going to share about, but because we've had so much difficulty in recording this, right, Jim?
This is our 4th time recording this episode. Yep.
We have had a different audio problem in recording this each time we've done it, all 3 other times. And we're sitting here back in my office again. We've recorded this in 3 different places.
Yep, we have.
It's been kind of crazy. But we would think it's really important. Mm-hmm. And happy to share it with you. First, what we want to do is talk a little bit about just the healing process. Mm-hmm. Jim, obviously, as a counselor with the experience that you have, a lot of people might wonder, okay, Ben shared this testimony about Jesus, prayer ministry, and I'm not quite sure what to think of that. Mm-hmm. Or, I believe Jesus can heal. I'm just not sure if he wants to heal me. Mm-hmm. From a counseling perspective, a psychological perspective, can you share a little bit about just some encouragement, some hope for healing?
Well, one of the things I do as a professor is train future counselors, and so I train them in what's effective in counseling and what's ineffective in counseling. And I also train them, or I should say teach them as to how we know counseling is effective. So I'd point our listeners to 2 different resources, which we'll put in the show notes. Some studies that were done through the American Psychological Association, and one that was done through the National Institutes of Mental Health. And they were just, researching how effective is counseling, how effective is therapy. And the NIH research was on 1,000 people who'd been to counseling, and they were asked, basically, was therapy effective for you? And 80% of them said, yeah, it helped. It was effective for me. 80% is a big number. It's not 100%, which is where I want it to be.
Right.
I have a lot of research as to why it's not 100%, so we can talk about that later. There's some explanations for why therapy doesn't seem to work for everyone. Part of it is, there's bad therapists. There's therapists who do poor counseling, but the other part of it is people don't always know how to be a good consumer of counseling and what they should be expecting in that. Which counselors should be training them how to, what to experience there, or, guiding them and coaching them there. But 80% feel that it was effective, and when you ask that same group, would you go back to counseling if you had problems in the future? 90% say, yeah, I'd go. Oh. So there's certainly a group that's just not going to go. They don't find it effective and they're never going to go. They're going to try for something else. But if you compare 80% against, let's say, psychiatric meds for anxiety or depression, like the SSRIs, like Prozac, or the SNRIs, the mood-regulating drugs, most people stop doing those drugs. 80% quit doing them within a month. So if you show up to your doctor and you say, hey, I'm not feeling good, and your doctor writes a prescription for you for one of those kinds of drugs, people quit in a month. 80% quit in a month. The people who do persist into the 2-month period, at 2 months, 60% of the people will feel 50% better. So compare that with 80% found counseling effective. And so I'm not really trying to compare apples and oranges. I mean, psychiatric medicine saves lives. I'm a fan. I'm a big fan of it. It's got side effects. It's got issues, but it gets people started down the healing road in most cases, because generally people show up, at least they'll talk to their doctor and say, hey, I'm not feeling good. What can we do?
Right.
If they have there's still some taboo around mental health and getting mental health services. So if they see their doctor, they'll get started. Maybe that then gives them the energy to, getting into talk therapy or getting into counseling, something like that.
Yeah, and certainly in not only those situations, but especially extreme situations of mental health where, somebody needs that in order to even be able to talk about what's going on.
Absolutely.
Or what has happened in their life, or be able to engage in like a counseling process.
Yeah.
They need that kind of medication.
Absolutely.
And, it can be, a great blessing, I think, for a lot of people, and has been in the past. We're going to talk a little bit more about the psychological basis for healing a few episodes from now.
Mm-hmm.
We'll talk more about this, but I think it's really worthwhile early on to share that, because although we're coming at this from a faith perspective, and both of us are men of faith, we know that modern psychology has given us a lot. A tremendous amount has brought healing to many, many people. And I think there's a lot of insights that the church can learn from modern psychology, and I just look forward to that kind of dialogue as we go.
Oh yeah, me too.
Go ahead. Transition a little bit back to what we were talking about at the start in terms of the message, really the core message that we want to share today. It's a story of healing that you experienced very recently. Could you share a little bit about that and why you think it is significant for our listeners?
So when you and I were first discerning what kinds of healing stories we wanted to share early in this series, the first one that came to my mind was the relationship with my father. Partly because it's so important to me personally, but also because almost every man in my life has had an area of trauma or wounding in their relationship with their father. And my experience has been most of them aren't talking to themselves about it, let alone anyone else. But I'm the guy who asks questions to people, and so it comes up in conversation with me. And it's a different experience for men. Obviously we're stereotyped as not talking about our feelings as much, and I think that's very much the case. Sure. So I wanted to share this story about this healing relationship, or this healed relationship and healing experience I've had with my own father. Now, this is fourth time you and I are sitting down to record this story. Right. And it just felt like something was working against this message getting out there. And I have a good relationship with my father, but I finally said, I need to call him and tell him and ask him, is it okay if I do this? Because I'm being vulnerable and exposing my own story and my own sin in it. In particular, the sin of pride that I carried for a long time as a result of holding grudges against my dad. But I need to respect him and say, are you okay with, because this is vulnerable for you too. And he agreed, but he said, no, this is an important message. We have to get this out there. So with his blessing, we are continuing on with the fourth attempt at this.
That's right.
But I think part of that is important because for the listeners to hear, I was in a really bad place with my dad for a long time. And I'm in a place now where I'm recording a podcast about our relationship, and I can call him up and say, are you okay with this? I want to do this. So he and I are in a good place now. And we weren't always there. And part of the history of that, as you've already heard a few times, it goes back to when my parents got divorced. And I'll make this story short, but I'll get the major points here. Basically, my family was the traditional American family growing up in the Midwest here. 2 parents living at home. We had four kids, built a home in the country, 10 acres, playing every day. My dad took us hiking, canoeing, camping, playing with us all the time. Just a great experience with both my parents. My mom was a great, family, made sure we always did family stuff together. I mean, I just had a great childhood up until my parents sat us down one afternoon and said they were getting divorced. I was about 10 years old, and I didn't really know what that was or what that meant, but I knew that a few parents I'd learned by then got divorced, and I said, okay, I don't know what that means, but here we go. And we left the house. My mom took the 4 of us kids and moved 20 miles away to another city, and we moved into this really small half of a house that was in an apartment, and my dad moved back home with his parents to kind of get back on his feet. And for a few years, the trauma of the divorce played out like this. It wasn't, my parents got divorced, that was traumatic. If my parents would have gotten divorced and we all would have moved to another city and I would have seen my dad all the time, it would have been different. But my dad was out of my life for a number of years in a very inconsistent kind of way, where we would expect to see him on every other Friday for a weekend, and sometimes he wouldn't show up. Sometimes it would be a no call, no show. And my mom would come out and tell us as we'd be sitting on the front porch, hey, your dad's not coming, or I guess he's not going to make it this weekend. And there was just, I don't know how many times that happened, but they hurt every single time. And so growing up, I was confused and then angry, especially as I became a younger teenager, because I started to realize that I was in poverty in a really bad way. And I wanted to blame somebody for that, so I started blaming him, because my mom was a secretary. She had a very small salary to raise us 4 kids, and we didn't have food and water all the time or electricity. We didn't have a vehicle almost ever up until I was in high school. She didn't, We had, by the grace of God, people helped take care of us. We got food from shelter in the food pantry, and we got, clothes dropped off on our front porch and stuff like that. And there were moments of grace for sure. But there was this, as I got older and older, this kind of burning hatred of, man, you really failed as a father. Like, your job is to protect and provide, and you haven't done that. And you've been kind of inconsistent in and out of my life. And he moved to different cities in the state, and we wouldn't see him very regularly. It was really hard as a young man.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah.
And I don't know how much people can relate to that, but that's my particular basis for where I started to get really prideful and saying things like, I'm never going to be like that. I'm never going to be that kind of man. I'm going to always take care of my family if I have a family. They'll never want for anything. I'll be better. I'll be perfect. He wasn't, but I will be. That kind of,
right.
Just this ridiculous lie.
Motivating yourself to an inner vow.
Yeah.
I made a vow to myself, but I've done it as a negation, as a in response to something I don't want to be, rather than simply something I want to be.
Right.
And we'll talk, I'm sure, in another episode about inner vows, but when we make those kind of decisions within ourselves based on, in reaction to something that, is perhaps an injustice against us or something like that, it seems rational, reasonable that I would decide, or you would decide, I don't want to be like him.
Right.
I want, but when it comes from that, when it comes from a bitterness, then you're just always chasing. And then anytime you happen to recognize something of your dad in yourself, or whatever, whatever the situation might be, then it's like you fail.
Oh yeah.
Because I can't be at all like,
Right.
And it's just really just a prison, a place that
I was going to say,
kind of locking yourself in to, and really just bringing judgment upon yourself, self-judgment, self-critique, and
there's nothing beautiful about saying what you don't want to be.
Right. Right.
And so that relationship got better over the years, and my dad got on his feet, and he got more stable employment and income and housing, and eventually my brother and I went and lived with him for a couple of years before I graduated high school, and he actually got his life together. I mean, he got remarried, he's been married for 25 years, and all this stuff, but I never looked at that side of his story and said, oh, that's an inspiring story. My dad, his life fell apart, and he put it back together. I want to be like that. Instead, for 20 years, I carried around this, we get along great, but you're really messed up back then, and we've never really dealt with that, so we probably should. Because my dad is much of the type of guy, let's just move on.
Sure.
And I like that personally. I mean, I like that kind of attitude. And that's where I get it from. It's pretty helpful to just say, well, no sense crying over spilled milk. Let's move on.
Right. In a lot of situations, that is a healthy response to small challenges that come up in life.
And I wanted to love him. I wanted to have a relationship with him. But I didn't realize that there was really still this major judgment that I was holding on against him until he'd done something to my son, who was only 2 years old. At least my perception was, he would promise to come to this party, and he canceled at the last minute to my son's birthday party, and I blew up at him, and I basically said, shouting in his face, like, you are not going to start to abandon him like you did me. And he stared at me like, I don't know what you're talking about. And I'm like, I don't know where that came from, but that's how I feel. I hadn't really consciously thought like, boy, now I have a son who's going to have a relationship with the man who let me down when I was a kid. I want to make sure that he doesn't feel, it was nothing like that. It was just, I love my dad. He's my son's grandfather. This is great. Right. But then he canceled on a party, and I just blew up.
And just brought that subconscious kind of judgment out. Yeah.
I was shocked and scared by it, frankly. And I thought, my God, what have I done? I just destroyed what I had with my dad. Because I laid major judgment down on him in that moment.
Right.
And I did destroy actually what we'd had. Now I've built something better. We've both built something better.
Sure.
And it took a while for us to sit back down again and talk. And when we did, he laid bare his soul to me, in a way I'd never seen before. He just said, let's talk about that time. And he made no excuses for himself, but he said, I was messed up in every possible way a man can be messed up. I couldn't, in essence, I couldn't do it. I couldn't be a father and a husband the way he wanted to. No man wants his marriage to fall apart or his children to be lost to him. I mean, I know that broke his heart, and I knew that then as a kid, but I never understood, like, and got outside my own perspective to see, like, I wonder why that happened. Wonder what was going on in his life. Did I ever stop and think about, my dad was raised without a father. His biological father was so abusive that his mom had to basically escape where they were living and move across the country to raise her 2 sons alone in poverty.
Right.
So he didn't even grow up with a dad or watching a husband interact with his mom. So it's hard to blame at the same time, like,
Right.
give the guy a break. He had a hard childhood too, and he didn't have everything modeled for him perfectly either. So this, after that blow up happened, I said, man, I really need healing in this. So I went to our priest, Father Steve, and I said, you got to help me with this. And he said, what's the most traumatic part of this? And I described to him this experience of being a kid, about 11, 12 years old, sitting on the front porch of my house on a Friday afternoon, waiting for my dad to come pick us up for the weekend, hoping I'm going to see the car come down the road, and we're going to jump in. It's going to be great. We're going to have a fun weekend. And so I'm just sitting there, and Father Steve says, just imagine that time again. So I can put myself back in that space, and I'm recollecting it. And he says, invite Jesus into the scene. So I invite Jesus into the scene. He comes walking down the sidewalk, and he walks right up to me, and he gets down to my eye level as I'm sitting down there as a little kid, and he says, hey, your dad's not going to make it today. I'm still working on him. And in that moment, when that realization came to me and I heard him say those words, I started crying, and my heart just broke open. I think for 2 reasons as I reflect back on it. I in that moment, was healed. And it took me a little bit of unpacking to understand what it was, but this is what I learned in that encounter, was that A, God hadn't abandoned me. I'd felt like my earthly father had abandoned me. And so because that happened, I really only had one person to blame, which was my heavenly Father. Like, why would you allow this to happen in my life? And when Jesus looked at me in the eye and said, I'm still working on him, he said it in a way that said, I'm working on everybody 24/7. I'm never not paying attention, and I was like, my dad dropped the ball and nobody picked it up, and Jesus was like, I did pick it up, but I also can't make anybody do anything. But I'm going to throw my grace in your life in every possible way I can so that you're taken care of. And if I now look back over that time period, I look back and I go, you know what? Life was hard. We did go without food. We went without water, electricity, and clothes and all this stuff. But we always had people coming in to take care and pick up the gaps. At one point we came home and there was a car in the driveway that somebody had gifted us. There would be boxes of clothes on the porch that would have been shipped to us from somebody. And they were nice stuff I was proud to wear to school because I was embarrassed for a long time about how I looked at school. And just other, things that happened. Families took us on summer vacations when my parents couldn't afford to do that, stuff like that. So I look back on it and say, wow, you really did have me. So the first thing it did was break my hatred and lie that I believed that God abandoned me for a while back then. And I sort of chose to have a relationship with him in spite of it. That's kind of how I went on as a Christian for a long time. And the second thing was that he's working on my dad. Oh yeah, I guess my dad needs working on. I'm mad because he's not a perfect father. I'm mad that he wasn't a perfect husband. Well, guess what? Nobody's perfect. But I hadn't given him that grace to say like, hey, I wonder if life was really hard for him. I wonder if he walked into this life without everything he needed to get on well in it. So it sounds ridiculous, but I had to forgive him. But he didn't really even need my forgiveness or deserve my forgiveness. I was judging him when I shouldn't have been.
Right.
So to say I forgave my father even sounds prideful. That I should judge him. No way. Like, I can't imagine doing that now. But that's where I was at the time before I had this experience of saying, like, Jesus, you tell me how to look at this. And when he showed me that, I believed a new truth, which was, my dad loved me. He always loved me. I knew that. And I came to believe that I was going to be I was taken care of by my heavenly Father. He didn't abandon me. And my dad did put his life back together again. And I never gave him credit for that, really, until this experience of, you were working on him, and he was working on himself too, actually. I mean, here's a guy who, our family filed for bankruptcy to move back with his parents, and he got one job after another, built himself up into a career, and got remarried, and raised a big family, and provided for everybody, and took care of everything eventually. But that's not what I was carrying around in my heart. Right. I wasn't focused on that. I was focused on the, hey man, remember back when You really dropped the ball. You haven't really made up for that, I'll forgive you when you do. I mean, that was my attitude back then. It's terrible to say it, but that's what it is.
Yeah, it's interesting. I see kind of like two threads in your story, kind of two graces. One is the grace to be able to honor your father.
Yeah.
To be able to be brought to a place in your heart where you're able to let go of that judgment and able to see him with a more proper, true perspective.
True. Yeah.
So that you can honor him. But also that you can still heal, because we know that even though somebody is worth honoring, there's still ways that they can hurt us. It's not just a black and white thing.
Yeah.
Where like either, somebody's on my side or they're against me. They're either my friend or my enemy. It's not so cut and dry like that. And I think we can fall into, different extremes that like I feel like I need so much healing because of what these people have done to me.
Right.
And there's no way I could ever honor them. I'm not just talking about parents, but you could talk about bosses, you could talk about coworkers, friends, whatever.
Yeah.
Or the other extreme is I'm supposed to honor these people, and I can't admit any time when they've hurt me.
Yes.
And I think especially
I was in that camp.
Right, especially as Christians.
Yeah.
We can easily go towards that route because we fear if I ever admit that like I felt hurt by them or what, then I'm not honoring them.
Yeah.
And and I think there's a tension there that I think only Jesus can really help us with, to be able to both honor but also be honest about what we might still need from our relationship with our parents or from whoever, that there was something I needed and I didn't get it, and I can still honor them for what they were able to provide for me, what how they were able to love me, but I still need to grow and mature as a person, and so I think the tension there is present in the way Jesus worked. Being able to bring healing to your heart, but also a perspective that allowed you to honor him and honor not just him as your father, but him as a man who has, put his life back together, has sort of been reborn. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that story.
I hope men take away from this that let's not kid ourselves. Our priest is fond of saying that to us when he's preaching homilies. Let's not kid ourselves. And so my message really is like, let's not kid ourselves that we've been wounded in different relationships. And we're just talking about father-son relationships today here. It could be mother-daughter, etc. It could be anything. Let's not kid ourselves. And I think you'll know kind of the test of the relationship you have with your parent now is, have you brought that wound to them? And I'm not saying that's always appropriate.
Sure.
That could be a bad idea in some cases. But are you honest with yourself first about it and sought out healing in that area? Because for me, I felt like, honestly, healing wasn't possible. It was just, I was going to just have to move on. I didn't even know how wounded I was, but I just was of the mind to just have to move on. So I hope people take away from this that we need to talk about this a little bit more with each other.
Yeah.
That we do have these issues from the past, and it's not like, oh, let's go back and dig up the past and have a catharsis as we
not a scavenger hunt for how
how bad our childhoods were and stuff. That's a waste of everyone's time.
Right.
The point of that is to say, look, we did have hard times, and what can we do about it now?
Well, and a way to kind of avoid that unhealthy sort of introspection of like seeking out, where I've been hurt. You mentioned how this wound that sort of rose to the surface, kind of seemingly out of nowhere, in response to your dad not planning to show up to your son's birthday party. You mentioned how it wasn't something that you were consciously thinking about, but that judgment kind of just rose up, and it's kind of like a bottle of a pop or a caffeinated carbonated drink that when it's shaken up a little bit and you're not aware of that, you start to open it a little bit and it just starts shooting out. And you have no idea.
And you're trying to contain it, but you can't put the cap back on at that point. It's over.
And you just get startled, and you're like, "Holy! I had no idea that this was that some sort of energy was was going to be released when this thing triggered it. I think when those types of things happen, when I find myself responding in a way that I don't feel free, somebody says something and it just sets me off, and I look around and I'm like, nobody else was like triggered to the degree I was just, and I don't feel free to be able to like keep myself from responding that way. I think that's a good test of whether I might need some healing there.
Oh yeah.
It's not this healing world, this process of healing isn't something that I just go searching for and I find, the next way that, I've been hurt, I've been wounded. It's, I look at my life, and if there are areas in my life that I don't feel free, or are causing real problems in relationships, and I don't know what to do next, that's when you enter into that kind of a process. And I think you noticed that. And I think this is just a perfect example.
I'd say I want to add two more things to that, which is one of the things that we do in therapy that's effective for people is give them perspective on their situation. Have you looked at it from this other point of view? So we know it's bad to look at things from only our point of view. That you can call that narcissism if you want, but it's not a good idea, whatever you want to call it. So when I looked at it from Jesus's point of view, it was like, I hadn't done that before. That was helpful. And the second thing is how that sin of pride played out in my life for a couple of decades was, I'm going to be perfect. Right. And so, when you shoot for perfection, your life's going to come unraveled at some point. And I was talking with some men recently about how men, I think, experience love from their parents, from their mother and fathers differently. From our mothers, when they say, I love you, we say, of course you do. Like, it's biological, Mom. You can't help but love me. Right. But when our dads say, I love you, what we really hear is, I respect you. Yeah. And almost in a way like you've done some things that have earned my respect. You're a man now. It's like they qualify us to get into the man tribe. And so when I hear from my dad, I love you. So I was trying really hard to win that from my dad for sure. Right. Like, I will be really good at this and good at that. And I can't be good at all the things that he loved, but I'll be good at things that he could still be proud of and just try to win his, affection, which is impossible. Right. It's impossible. Right. Like,
well, and what happens when you do win that affection? You feel like, I've been working so hard for so long to win it. Did they notice that I was, like?
Well, not only that, but
then to get in your head, it's like.
Well, for me, it was a lot of like achieving a lot of things in my career, in particular in my education. It was like if I lost any of that stuff, then my respect from him would be at risk. Right. My love would be at risk. So there's also that tension of, man, now that I've earned it, I got to keep it. I don't feel that way anymore. Right. Now I feel free. Right. I love my wife, not because my dad had a hard time loving his wife, or I feel like I'm trying to be a good father, not in response to my dad struggled to be a good father. I struggle to be a good father and a good husband. Right. and I don't try to get all the accolades and achievement in my life so that I can bring them to the foot of my father and say, aren't you proud of me? That's not my life anymore. But it was that way for a while. I wanted to earn that love from him, and that's ridiculous. Sorry for anybody who's listening who's like trying to do that. Stop doing that.
Yeah. Jim, thank you very much for being willing to share that story. I know it's not easy to share those kind of personal stories, but I think it's such a beautiful witness of healing and such an important topic, a relationship between a father and a son. And I'm so glad when you shared with me that you had, talked with your dad about it and gotten his blessing. I think that's just so important. Be able to maintain honor while still being able to talk about and be vulnerable with each other about our hurts and our difficulties and our healing journey. Could you close us with a prayer, maybe especially for father relationships and father-son relationships?
Lord, we just ask you to, give us your eyes. Help us to see our life not just through ours, but your eyes too. Help us, Lord, to forgive, to not hold judgment against anyone, to accept that everyone is on a healing road, and to accept that it's not our job to judge them or move them along, but it's your responsibility, and that you're working on it. And we just give that to you, and leave it to the person to accept your grace and move forward with that. So Lord, we just ask that, and I also ask just that you'd pour your grace down on men, especially listening to this message, that you would inspire them to take a step in this healing journey with their own fathers. And that can be done, Lord, without their father even being present. They can go to you with this stuff and be healed. So I want you, please inspire them to do that. That's my prayer. And I ask all this in Jesus' name.
Amen. Amen. Well, thank you, Jim. Next week on the Healing Road podcast, we're going to be talking with Jim about a talk that he recently had released from Lighthouse Catholic Media and the Augustine Institute called Crisis of Happiness. He's going to share some of his insights as an addictions counselor about the healing process. We'll talk about addictions in particular, but I think it'll be a really fruitful episode, just kind of taking some broad strokes, painting with some broad strokes about the healing process. So we'll put in the show notes a link to the talk with Lighthouse and the Augustine Institute. You can listen to a 5-minute preview on there, and otherwise you'll hear about it a little bit next week with episode 4. Thank you very much for joining us. You can connect with us at healingroadpodcast.com or search for Healing Road Podcast on Facebook. God bless.
God bless.